I didn't steal a single cent. My voice cracked across the courtroom, but not one person in that room turned toward me with any kind of doubt. My brother Cole stood at the front, calm and composed, like he had been rehearsing this moment for months. "She forged everything," he said, his voice steady and clear. He pointed at me without hesitation, like I was a stranger, like the years we had shared under the same roof meant absolutely nothing. My mother sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap. She did not look at me once. My father sat beside her, nodding slowly, like the verdict was already carved in stone before any of this began. Evidence appeared on the screen behind the judge. My name, my signature, transaction records with my initials on every line. The judge's voice became a blur somewhere in the distance. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. This was not a mistake. This was a setup. Perfect one. My name is Brooke Voss. In less than 10 minutes that morning, my family erased everything I had spent 32 years building. My accounts were frozen before I even left the building. The words "under criminal investigation" were attached to my name in documents I had never seen before that day. As two officers walked me toward the exit, I turned back once and looked at my mother across the crowded room. She was not watching the judge. She was not watching the evidence still displayed on the screen behind the bench. She was watching me, and the expression on her face stopped me cold. It was not sadness. It was not guilt. It was relief, quiet, settled, complete relief, like a woman who had been waiting a long time for something difficult to finally be finished. In that single moment, everything I had refused to believe became undeniable. My family had not made a mistake. They had not panicked and pointed at the wrong person. They had chosen me, and they had needed me gone. They held me at a processing office for most of the afternoon. I sat in a plastic chair in a room that smelled like old paper and fluorescent light, and I made myself think. I went back through every document I had seen on that courtroom screen, reconstructing each one piece by piece in my mind. The signatures were mine, or close enough that a quick glance would not catch the difference. But something was off. My real signature had a specific habit. The R in Brooke always pulled slightly upward before the double O. On every one of those documents the R was smooth and level. Someone had studied my handwriting carefully, but not carefully enough. They had copied the shape without copying the habit. That kind of precision did not come from a stranger. It came from someone who had watched me sign my name dozens of times without me ever noticing them watching. This was not something thrown together in a hurry. Someone had been preparing this for a very long time. I waited for 5 hours in that room before anyone came to speak with me. But no one came for the reasons I had hoped. No family member. No call from someone saying this was all a misunderstanding. No lawyer arranged to fix the situation quietly. Nothing. When I was finally allowed to use my phone, I opened my contacts and started calling. My mother's number. My father's number. Cole's number. Every single one had been blocked. Not just unreachable, actively blocked. My calls went nowhere. My messages showed no delivery at all. I stood in that corridor holding my phone and staring at the screen for a long moment. A person who panics after making a terrible mistake does not sit down and block every number before the day is over. A person who panics scrambles and calls and tries to manage the damage they caused. What I was looking at was not panic. It was coordination. Careful, deliberate, pre-planned coordination. And it had been completed before I ever sat down in that courtroom. The court assigned me a public defender named Amy Walsh. She was young, overworked, and clearly managing too many cases at once. But she was sharp. During our second meeting, she said something that stopped me mid-sentence. She told me she had been following the prosecution timeline, and something about it did not feel right. The case was not being pushed forward with any urgency. There were no demands for a quick trial date. No pressure from the other side to accelerate proceedings. Instead, the filings kept arriving in slow, carefully spaced intervals, enough to keep the case technically active but not enough to bring it to a real conclusion. "It feels like someone wants you right here," Amy said, tapping the edge of the table. "Not convicted. Not cleared. Just stuck." I sat with that for a long moment after she said it. They did not want me in prison. Prison would give me access to lawyers, appeals, systems designed to find the truth. They wanted something quieter than that. They wanted me frozen. I thought about it for days after Amy's observation, and the more I turned it over, the clearer the picture became. My family ran a business together, Voss Holdings, a mid-sized investment firm my father had built over 30 years. I had managed its financial operations for the last 8 years. I knew where everything was, how it moved, and who approved what. That made me dangerous. If they had convicted me and sent me to prison, there would have been appeals, hearings, discovery processes, all of which would have meant outside eyes on the company's records. If they had cleared me outright, I could have returned to my position and started asking uncomfortable questions. But if they kept me under a permanent cloud of suspicion, professionally destroyed, socially discredited, I would never be believed again. I could not fight for the company. I could not question their decisions. I could not walk into any room and be taken seriously. That was the real plan. Not to lock me away, just to make sure I could never come back. So I made a decision that went against every instinct I had. I stopped fighting. I stopped making calls, filing requests, and demanding answers. I went quiet, completely, deliberately quiet. I allowed the public narrative to settle around me. Let people believe I was guilty. Let my name carry the weight of what they had built. Let my family assume they had one. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, because every part of me wanted to scream the truth from every rooftop. But screaming would not help me. Not yet. My family had resources, connections, and years of preparation. I had nothing, no money, no platform, no evidence that would hold in any room. Fighting loud and angry was exactly what they expected. And fighting on their terms would only push me further into the corner they had designed. So I did the one thing they did not expect. I disappeared. I gave them the ghost they wanted. And I started building something they could never see coming. I moved to a different city and took a job doing night bookkeeping for a mid-sized warehouse company. The pay was modest, the hours were quiet, and nobody asked questions. I used a shortened version of my name, just Brooke, and kept my history brief when anyone asked. During the day, while the rest of the building was empty and silent, I studied. I ordered financial law textbooks from used bookstores and worked through them page by page. I took an online course in forensic accounting using a prepaid card and an email address no one knew existed. I read case studies about fraud detection, how people build false paper trails, how they cover transfers, where mistakes tend to appear. I was not doing this out of anger, even though the anger was always there, sitting quietly beneath everything I did. I was doing it because I had made myself one promise the day I walked out of that courtroom. When I came back, I would not be coming back empty-handed. I was going to be ready. About 8 months into my disappearance, I opened the old archived email files I had backed up to a private cloud account years earlier. A quiet habit I had developed after first noticing small irregularities in the company's records. I had never thought much of them at the time, just a precaution. But sitting in a small apartment at 2 in the morning with a cold cup of coffee beside me, I went through every folder with fresh eyes. And that was when I found it. A transfer approval document attached to an internal email, dated 4 weeks before the period the prosecution had identified as the start of my supposed embezzlement. The approval signature at the top was not mine. It belonged to my father. He had authorized a significant fund movement from Voss Holdings to an account I did not recognize. One transaction. One date. For weeks too early. My father had moved money before I was supposed to have started anything. That single document was not a coincidence. It was a crack in their story. That one document opened a door I could not close. Over the following months, I went back through every archived file, every email thread, every spreadsheet from my years at Voss Holdings. I was no longer reading them as normal business records. I was reading them the way a forensic investigator would. And what I found was a pattern hiding in plain sight for years. Shell accounts. Transfers routed through subsidiaries with no real business activity. Payments to vendor names that appeared on paper, but left no trace in any public registry. My family had not just framed me to take control of Voss Holdings. They had been using Voss Holdings as a vehicle for something far larger and far more illegal for years before I became their scapegoat. I was not the beginning of the corruption. I was the exit plan for it. The one person who needed to disappear so no one would ever look too closely at what the company had really been doing all along. The discovery about my brother Cole came later, on a night I almost stopped looking. I had been going through internal access logs, records of who had logged into which systems and when that I had saved during my last weeks at Voss Holdings. I had pulled them originally to investigate a minor payroll discrepancy and never looked at them properly. But that night, scanning through timestamps and user credentials, I found something I was not prepared for. Cole had logged into the company's financial system using my credentials. Not once, multiple times, over a period of 4 months, all of them ending 3 weeks before the day I was brought into that courtroom. He had not just been a witness against me. He had been the one creating the evidence. Every fraudulent transaction carrying my name had been initiated from my login during hours when I had not been in the building. Cole had not just lied on that stand. He had spent 4 months quietly building the lie from the inside out. For a long time, I had told myself that being chosen as the scapegoat was random, that my family had grabbed for the nearest person when they needed someone to absorb the blame. But the more evidence I uncovered, the clearer it became that it was not random at all. They had chosen me with deliberate precision. I was the one in the family with no criminal record, no history of financial trouble, and no obvious motive for greed. I had spent 8 years managing the company's finances with a consistent reputation for accuracy. A scapegoat with a clean record produces shock. It makes people say, if she did it, anyone could. It shifts doubt away from the people with real reasons to hide things. Choosing someone careful, quiet, and trusted makes the accusation feel credible. It makes the truth feel like paranoia. I had not been an accidental choice. I had been a strategic one. My own honesty had been the most effective weapon they could have used against me. About a year and a half into my research, I reached out to a former Voss Holdings employee named Ray Sutton. He had left the company 6 months before my court date. Around the same period I had first noticed the irregularities, and I had always wondered about the timing of his departure. I sent him a brief message from an anonymous email address, saying only that I was researching a matter connected to the company. He called back within the hour. The moment I mentioned Voss Holdings, his tone changed completely. He went from cautious to completely shut down in the space of 1 sentence. "I can't help you," he said, and ended the call. 3 minutes later, a text arrived from the same number. 4 words. "Stop digging. They're watching." I read it twice. Then I read it again. He had not sent that warning because he thought I was chasing the wrong story. He had sent it because he knew exactly how right I was. And that terrified him. For 3 days after Ray's text, I barely slept. I sat with that forward message and let it do what it was designed to do, make me afraid. And it worked. I thought about what my family was capable of. They had managed to frame me inside a courtroom with forged documents and a family member willing to lie under oath. They had money, lawyers, connections, and years of preparation. If they could erase me legally once, they could find other ways to silence me permanently. For 3 days, the fear was real and loud. But on the 4th morning, I got up early, made coffee, sat at the window, and let myself remember the courtroom. The specific way my mother had looked at me, that settled, finished relief, and the way Cole had pointed at me without flinching. The fear was real, but so was everything they had done. And I had come too far and built too much to let a 4-word text pull me back into silence. I changed my approach after that. Working alone was necessary, but it was not enough to bring something this large into the open. I needed structure. I set up a secure external drive with encrypted backups of everything I had collected, the access logs, the transfer records, and the archived emails. Then I started feeding selected pieces to an investigative journalist named Paul Reeves, who worked for a financial accountability publication that had covered corporate fraud cases before. I never told him who I was. I communicated through a secondary email account and shared only what I wanted him to have, enough to make the story credible, but never the full picture all at once. I gave him pieces, carefully chosen pieces, timed deliberately, each one building on the last. Paul did not know he was receiving information from the woman at the center of the very story he was developing. And that anonymity was not just protection. It was strategy. I would reveal myself only when the moment was exactly right. While I worked in the shadows, my family flourished in full public view. Over the 2 years following my court date, Voss Holdings had grown significantly. My father announced a series of new investment partnerships with firms I had never heard of during my time at the company. Articles appeared in regional business publications praising the company's direction. My mother attended charity events and smiled for photographs. Cole began appearing at industry gatherings as a spokesperson for the firm, something he had never been positioned to do during my years there, because everyone who actually understood the company's operations knew he had limited grasp of them. But now, with me erased, he filled the space that had been cleared for him. From the outside, they looked like a family that had survived a difficult period and come out stronger. From where I was sitting, working through their financial records in a quiet apartment, I could see what that public success was really built on. And the higher they climbed, the more visible the fall would be. By the third year, I had assembled a significant body of evidence: the archived emails with the predated transfer, the access logs showing Cole's unauthorized use of my credentials, the shell account patterns, the vendor irregularities. Enough to tell a compelling story of fraud. But I was still missing one specific thing, and I knew that without it, my case had a gap my family's lawyers would drive straight through. Everything I had demonstrated a financial pattern and an inconsistency in the timeline. What I did not yet have was proof that they had deliberately and intentionally framed me, not just that fraud had occurred, but that it had been engineered to place the blame specifically and knowingly on my shoulders. In a courtroom, that distinction mattered enormously. The difference between these records looked suspicious, and these people planned to destroy her required something direct, something undeniable, something that could not be explained away as coincidence or mismanagement. I needed them to say it in their own words. It came from arrogance. My family had grown comfortable. 3 years had passed since the courtroom. I had been silent and invisible for so long that they had stopped thinking of me as any kind of threat. That ease, the ease that comes from believing you have won completely, made them careless. One of my sources, a contact I had cultivated carefully through Paul's network, managed to access a recording from a closed Voss Holdings boardroom call. It had been made by an internal participant and leaked as part of a separate dispute that had nothing to do with me. But when I received it and pressed play, I heard a voice I recognized immediately. My father. Speaking in the same measured, business-like tone he used for every serious conversation. Clear and unhurried. Calm, the way you only speak about something you are completely certain of. As long as Brooke stays buried, he said, none of this touches us. I sat completely still and let the words settle around me. Not suspicion. Not implication. Admission. I listened to the recording 10 times over the following 2 hours. Not because I needed to confirm what I had heard, the words were clear the first time, but because each time I played it I heard something new in the tone. The relaxed certainty. The complete absence of guilt or caution. He was not whispering. He was not hedging. He said my name in that sentence the way you refer to a problem that has already been solved. He said stays buried, not is buried. Present tense, ongoing, like something that needed constant maintenance rather than something that had simply happened. That told me they were still actively keeping me down, still making sure I stayed gone, which meant they were still afraid of what would happen if I came back. I had the financial records. I had the forged credentials. I had a boardroom recording with my father's own voice saying my name like a liability he was managing. All I needed now was the right moment to bring it all into the open. I did not rush. That was the single most important discipline of those years, knowing when to wait. My family had spent a long time rebuilding their public image, and I understood that the timing of my return had to be precise. If I moved too early, they would spin the narrative before it could take hold. If I moved when the public eye was already on them, the contrast would be impossible to ignore. What I needed was a moment when they were at their most visible and most convinced they were untouchable. That moment came at the beginning of my 4th year of waiting. Voss Holdings announced a major merger with a regional investment group. The kind of deal that drew financial media, industry attention, and a significant public audience. Press releases were issued. Statements were prepared. My father was being celebrated everywhere I looked. The spotlight was fully on them. I let them step completely into it. Then, quietly and without any warning, I made my move. For the first time in 4 years, I stepped back into the world under my real name. I contacted Amy Walsh, my former public defender, who had never fully believed I was guilty and had stayed loosely in touch with me over the years. I told her I had evidence and was ready to move. She put me in contact with Carol Haynes, a financial crimes attorney who specialized in white-collar fraud and wrongful prosecution. I walked into Carol's office the following morning with a hard drive, printed documents, and a copy of the boardroom recording. I laid everything out in order. The predated transfer signed by my father, Cole's system access logs proving unauthorized use of my credentials, the shell account patterns, the forged signatures, and finally the recording. Carol listened to every word. She reviewed each item without rushing me. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked up. "We can file today," she said. I nodded. After 4 years of silence, I was finally ready to be heard. The motion was filed quietly, without press releases or public announcements. That was deliberate. Carol and I agreed that the best approach was to let the legal process begin moving before my family had any opportunity to prepare a counter-narrative. Within 48 hours, a judge had reviewed the preliminary evidence and granted an emergency order. The investigation that had followed me for 4 years was officially re-examined. This time the focus shifted. Auditors were assigned to Voss Holdings. Warrants were issued for the company's financial records. Cole's system access logs were subpoenaed. The accounts connected to the shell vendor names I had identified were flagged and frozen. Within a week, 2 financial news reporters, one of them Paul Reeves, who now finally learned the identity of the source he had been working with for years, published stories that cracked the public narrative completely. By the end of that week, the investigation that had carried my name for 4 years was no longer about me. It was about them. The formal hearing was scheduled 6 weeks after the motion was filed. I had not been inside a courtroom since the day my family had stood there and dismantled my life in front of me. Walking through those doors again felt entirely different. I was not the same person who had stood there 4 years ago, shaking and confused, reaching for a family that had already cut every thread. I walked in with Carol beside me and a case file that had taken years to assemble. My family was already seated when I entered. My father sat between 2 attorneys. Cole was beside him, and for the first time in years, he looked directly at me, then immediately looked away. My mother sat 1 row back, hands in her lap, eyes fixed somewhere past the room entirely. The same screens that had once displayed my name and my supposed crimes were now loaded with their own transactions, their own records, their own signatures on documents that told a very different story. The boardroom recording was played in full. The judge allowed it without objection. Its authenticity had been verified before the hearing began. The room went completely still when my father's voice filled it. I watched faces as they heard him say my name in that calm, careless tone. Then came Cole's access logs showing repeated logins under my credentials. Then the predated transfer approval in my father's name. Then the shell accounts displayed in a timeline that showed clearly they had been active for years before I was accused of anything. My father's attorneys spoke twice and were cut off both times by evidence that directly contradicted their arguments. Cole sat rigid in his chair and did not look up from the table once. My mother pressed her fingers to her mouth. My father set down his pen at some point and did not pick it up again. Their empire did not fall in an explosion. It came apart the way a carefully built lie always does, quietly, piece by inevitable piece, in front of everyone. I walked out of that courtroom on a clear Tuesday morning with my name fully and legally restored. The criminal investigation against me was formally closed. My father and Cole faced separate criminal referrals for fraud, financial deception, and malicious prosecution. The merger my family had been celebrating fell apart within days as partners quietly withdrew. Voss Holdings went into receivership within the month. I did not take any of it. I did not want their money or their company or any portion of what they had built on corruption and lies. I had built something of my own in those 4 years, small, clean, and entirely mine. A financial consulting practice started quietly in the city where I had been invisible for so long. My name meant something again. But this time it meant something I had made myself on ground my family could never touch. They had tried to erase Brooke Voss. All they had done was give her time to become someone they could never control again.